Are your neighbors anti-democratic fascists? Welcome to the Rabble Report. We're back from our winter hibernation, and today we're looking at what's really behind something that's caused a lot of anxiety around the political world, right-wing populism, with friend of the show, Dr. Tietze, who has a forthcoming book on the phenomenon of anti-politics. Tad, welcome back to the show.
Thanks very much. Great to be back.
We're also here with Joe.
So last time we had you on, we discussed left-wing populism in great detail. Maybe that's where we start. Like, what makes right-wing populism distinct from left-wing populism?
Probably more popular, right? Isn't that the problem that everyone's wrestling with?
There's also this other term for it, national populism as well, right? And it's actually the title of this book by Roger Eaton and Matthew Goodwin. And you suggested this book to us a little while back. Can you introduce it? Why do you think it's worth looking at, even though it came out in 2018? In a lot of ways, I think it's more relevant. In some ways, some things have changed.
Yeah. I think it was one of the first books from academia that really tried to take the right-wing populist phenomenon seriously without being hostile to it. I think that's kind of what set it apart. And certainly one of the authors, Matthew Goodwin, who, as far as I can tell, had a fairly standard centre-lefty trajectory in academia, and had written books about the rise of the far right and stuff, was essentially afterwards excommunicated from centre-lefty academia for having been too soft on right-wing populism. The book's an interesting book. I think it's good because it sets out a whole series of things that might have caused the rise in popularity of these parties in the United States, Europe, and other parts of the world. The focus is very much on sort of the advanced economies of the world, the liberal democratic countries. And I thought the thing that was best about it is it really did refer to the hollowing out of politics that the Rabble Report has constantly been going on about, the hollowing out of the social basis of politics and the way that creates an opening for new political formations. And the other side of it, though, is it tries to explain the rise of these parties. Remember, in 2018, we're talking, this is just post-Brexit and post-Trump 1 being elected. It's trying to suggest that there is actually a constituency and there's a policy gap there. We talked a lot about policy gaps last time I was on. And there's a gap of representation, and that these national populists are filling it. And I guess probably one of the best things, and it's only seen in some of the literature around the populism, is that the question of sovereignty comes up. That there's a real sense in the book that you get that they're grappling with how people feel, many voters feel like the popular part of sovereignty is gone. The politicians are acting sort of against them or their own interests or on projects that don't really match what people actually want. And that sovereignty question comes up. And I guess for those two authors, it's the national sovereignty that's the solution to the problem. That there's been a loss of national power. And I guess they're writing from within Europe, from a recently, Brexit voted, but yet not yet fully Brexited UK. You're looking at a situation where the sovereign question has come up and is brought up by these populists in terms of national sovereignty. We've lost our power to global institutions, to unelected bureaucracies. The people need to take control of the nation again. So I guess that's kind of the things that I really liked about the book, even though there's weaknesses to the book, I think, but took the subject really seriously and wasn't immediately hostile. There's certainly a lot of academic writing at the time. The Trump phenomenon and the Brexit phenomenon both created industries of academic writing that were hostile to Trump or Brexit, but which was centered on the idea of explaining it, but from a hostile viewpoint. So this book was different.
Right. I mean, I was watching a talk from Roger Eatwell, one of the two authors of the book, and he opens by saying, a lot of academics and journalists are obviously pretty hostile to the phenomenon of national populism. And, not a lot of democracy scholars really look on it favorably. And he asks the question, is this because national populism is a threat to democracy, or is this because academics and journalists tend to be left of center? But, this book, for all of its flaws that we might get into, it insists voters are not dupes, right? It offers explanations other than seeing the public as evil, right? But that's also maybe it takes the public seriously, but that also might be where some of the limitations we could discuss are, in that, like, I think it really sees a social base to national populism and kind of overweights that this idea that there is a rise in nationalist, perhaps even right-wing ideology in society. Whereas I think the framework we use in this show is more likely to see these populists as kind of scavenger parties, right? Eatwell and Goodwin see them as more than just leveraging the breakdown of the old parties, that they have a social basis. Whereas, we've tracked in our previous episodes, the rise of mass politics, the decline into these cartel parties that are kind of in, but that's also, I think, an important question, right? So when the right-wing populists arrive on the scene, where are the mainstream parties at, right? What I think there's a level of decay and decline that took place. Most people see it starting in the 70s with neoliberalism, but starting in the 1950s with what Otto Kirchheimer calls the catch-all party. Sort of right after World War II, we see a decline in the representative function of political parties that, through this slow unraveling of the mainstream parties has led us to where we are today, which, that might be the beginnings of why is a party system's explanation more helpful than seeing the populists as having a social base.
And something I think is interesting too, actually, is with the decline of the political party system, what becomes and with the decline of the social basis of the political parties that existed independently of them, what reference points does politics wind up having? And I think that's why national populism tends to be national populism.
Can you say more about that? Why do you think it has to be national?
Well, it winds up being the only basis for democratic politics, ultimately. The European Union doesn't really have a demos, does it? The power doesn't really rest within the European Parliament and the European Union. That's one of the main issues that it has when it comes to having public legitimacy, or having, or even like dealing with populists that are Eurosceptic. So that's one instance. But also, I think it goes down to, it comes down to, I think, citizenship as well. And I think we discussed this actually in the last episode. If citizens don't feel like the state respects that relationship between society and the state that citizenship is, that becomes a core democratic problem. And also immigration winds up factoring into this as well, because it becomes a question of what does the political state exist for? What does it exist to serve?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And you can see it even when countries aren't really beholden to international institutions in a serious way, like the United States. The political class is constantly looking to institutions that are not really national. Like, and I guess, in some ways, the United States has been a bit weird, because since World War II, it's been the universal power, hasn't it? It's projected itself not as having a national interest, but as having the interests of all freedom, democracy, wealth generation, and so on. It's definitely projected itself that way. First of all, against the communist bloc, and then as the single hegemon of the post-1989 world. You can see how voters can feel the national interest is being trashed. You can see how they can look at Clinton allowing, China's accession into the WTO, and then whatever economic changes happened afterwards and whatever job losses happened, you can blame it on that moment of betrayal of the nation, I guess. So it makes a lot of sense. In policy terms, it sounds right. Whether it's what's really going on is a different question, I think.
Right. And to understand that, maybe we need to reiterate just what we mean by social base for politics. I mean, it's such a central conversation topic we're going to be discussing. And if we're setting up the key kind of thing is, is there a surge of right-wing ideology or is there a surge of nationalism in society, right? Well, I could see somebody going, how is there not? You've got all of these, right-wing or nationalist populist movements entering the public sphere, sort of, they go from success to success, which reform in the UK with Nigel Farage, Trump, AfD in Germany, Maloney in Italy, National Rally in France, Argentina, Brazil, Romania. The list just goes on and on. How is there not something in society driving this? So maybe we need to talk a little bit about what we consider a social base, right? Why do we have this term in the first place?
Yeah, I think, well, you see the term social base in all kinds of articles now. People talking about social bases. I guess because all of us are influenced by Marx in some way, we would probably want to have a materialist understanding of what a social base is rather than just a collection of voters. Because there's people have an electoral, a party can have an electoral base, it can be bigger or smaller, there can be large swings in elections. But the social base, I think the common understanding we have is that there is a set of party and extra party institutions in society that exist over the longer term. They're not just things that spring up for the election. They involve lots and lots of members of society, members of civil society, not all of whom are politicians or intending to be part of a professional political class, but feel aligned with a certain set of politics through their connections with those social institutions. And the classic in the party, sort of the party systems literature, the classic example, of course, is the trade unions, the rise of the workers' movement in the late 19th century, the formation of mass trade unions, including industrial trade union, and the way that they provided an institutional social base that reproduced itself over generations, and that politicians of the left tended to relate to them, whereas the politicians of the right tended to relate to other kinds of organizations. But there are all kinds of variants on the theme. Like the United States is classic for having weak unions, but on the other hand, the United States also had lots of large social institutions, civil society institutions. From those famous lodges that we outside of the United States, having come from Australia and New Zealand, we were wondering what are these strange lodges with people's moose heads and so on that you guys have in the United States. But there was a whole set of civic associations, including those kinds of associations. I guess in places like Australia, Rotary clubs would be a similar thing, business associations, all kinds of different associations that were not formally part of the political sphere, but were very connected to it and had their own life independent of the political sphere.
And these are things that,
organizations, yeah. Sorry.
And these are things that decline starting, embryonically right after World War II, really. And that's, maybe a topic for another time, but I think the key takeaway here is that long before the populists really arrived on the scene or started having successes in the way they are, this gap between politics and society became more clear and more obvious through the way that the parties changed from mass membership organizations to sort of vote seeking. Instead of a party representing a social group like the working class or Christians of a particular denomination or business or things like that, parties went from that kind of representative instrument out of society, which is itself a compromise in a way, but they become state institutions, that are looking for voters everywhere. So you try and mix and match voters from different social groups, and you are an institution in the state. And this is something that starts right after World War II with the catch-all party, it's called.
Yeah.
And then it just devolves into this thing called the cartel party. But that is for another time. We have other episodes on that. I think the key takeaway, just from reiterating that, is if this is a real social base that populism has, right? And this relates to also the question about is right-wing populism fascism, right? Fascism had the brown shirts and the people in the streets and the violence every day, shooting each other in the streets with the communists and that kind of thing. So if right-wing populism is a real social base, why does it remain organizationally thin, right? Why doesn't it generate its own trade unions, its own mass membership organizations, durable civil institutions of some kind? And why don't voters, when we poll them, exhibit a radical increase in national populist views over time? Maybe they're a little bit separate from the political class on immigration, but actually, even in the United States with Donald Trump, it's not, people are not radically anti-immigration. There's a change slightly when you have Joe Biden in power, which has more to do with the sense that the process was thrown out the window. But like a mass hostility to immigration of the type of previous kind of panics in, the 19th century or something like that, it's not there empirically.
Yeah, and I think immigration's a very important question because so immigration is, people have two types of views on immigration. Is immigration generally a good thing? Is it generally helpful? Am I generally for immigration? And there's a split in society, but there's actually a gradation of people's views. On the other hand, you have, is there currently an immigration crisis going on of some sort because the border is porous or the government has lost control? People's views can swing wildly on that view of immigration, much more dramatically than they do on sort of more long-term views about the benefits of immigration and so on. Those things have to be pulled apart, I think. In a sense, Biden overcorrected for what was an unpopular Trump policy of being too harsh on immigration, and went too far the other way. And so people's views swung because actually it looked like the politicians were completely lost control or were willfully, causing damage to the country. So I think that's not really an exception. On most other social views, we see a very long-term stability now over decades in most Western countries. People's views on many social issues, particularly issues of race, clear that people have become either rapidly or slowly less racist over time on average. Hostility to other what were out groups. There's clearly been a huge opening up to positivity around things like same-sex marriage. Even though it's been a highly contested issue, there's clearly a lot of sympathy towards trans people in this recent period, despite controversies over various policies. And I'll be able to provide you with a link if you want to give it to your viewers. But there was a very good article done, which came out in about 2018, 2019, which looked at nationalist sentiment in Western countries and in rich Western countries. And nationalist sentiment has not been rising either on a series of measures. There's maybe been a small increase more recently in some follow-up work done by the same author. But there's been this kind of steadiness. And of course, on economic issues, which I think we talked about last time, people have had this kind of middle of the road, views on economics. They've tended to not be full-on free marketeers or full-on the state must do everything. They've tended to be somewhere in between, and they fluctuate a bit over time. There hasn't been an economic policy radicalization happening anywhere around the world. Of course, there are temporary periods of time, like you can imagine in Greece and Spain, people came up with some pretty radical views in the middle of the Eurozone crisis when they were facing horrific austerity. But even those things tend to be quite transient. Things tend to even out in a kind of middle of the road view. There's all these social issues where there hasn't really been a move to the right. And there hasn't been a move, because the national populists will argue that, of course, economically, they're not necessarily free marketeers. They may well be into more state intervention. And I think Eatwell and Goodwin make this point that it's not about, in fact, free market policies may be one of the things that drives people away from the traditional centre right and centre left. But even there, if there's no clear sort of direction which you can look at, which explains the votes of any of these parties rising. So something else has to be going on.
You know what I'm curious about too, actually? You're talking about national sentiment too, right? Can you dig more into that, actually? Like, what is nationalist sentiment?
If you look, not just at Eatwell and Goodwin, but if you take people who are hostile to the rise of right-wing populism, like Pippa Norris, who's a very famous social and political scientist, she did some work around the time of Trump, around 2015, 16, looking for this group of nationalist voters. And cross-sectionally, at one time, she and her co-author, whose name is just escaping me, sorry, they found that there was this solid group of nationalists, people who were, they tended to be more male, they tended to be more middle-aged. There was this group of people who had these kind of nationalist views. Now, of course, if you ask Pippa Norris, she would say they're pretty regressive views because she's very much a left-leaning academic. But interestingly, there was this group, smaller probably than what national populist parties are getting now. But at that time, the numbers seemed to match quite well. Of course, it was only cross-sectional. Those authors also didn't look at a longitudinal picture, just like Eatwell and Goodwin can't demonstrate a longitudinal upward trend in nationalism. So, interesting. I do think the thing you said, Joe, is right. There's something about the sovereignty question that then translates back into the national question in that sense, in the sense of a responsive national political sphere.
So, in brief, I mean, the answer is well, right? But how are the national populists doing around the world right now at the time? Where are they most likely to score their next victories? I mean, we're looking at reform in the UK, national rally in France, election coming up in a couple of years. What is there was a discussion at the Biden administration's advent that even Eatwell and Goodwin were participating in, which was, have we reached peak populism? Which this is clearly not the case. And one of the things about Eatwell and Goodwin, to their credit, they were discouraging the drumbeat of we have reached peak populism, which was sort of a coping mechanism that arose in academia, I think.
Well, you've got to remember that periodically in every national polity, when the populists do less well than was the upper limit of expectations, there is an intense conversation about the strike back of liberal democracy and that the adults are back in the room. This happens repeatedly. I think Emmanuel Macron has managed it a few times now. Every time he doesn't do as badly as people expect. For example, when he was re-elected, this wave of euphoria crashes out. And his first election victory was a wave of euphoria also, because he managed to divert the things that were the underlying basis of the populist success into a more technocratic kind of project. So each time people go, I would say France and the United Kingdom are the obvious next dominoes to fall, but also don't count out the possibility that where populists do badly, let's say after being in power, that they can also come back later on. Donald Trump has now proven that. He's a very, very unpopular president, historically speaking, and he managed to come back despite everything that was raged against him. So I wouldn't count the populists out. I'm talking about in terms of the major Western countries. Probably the other place where it will have particular ramifications is here in Germany, where if the AfD end up being the highest supported party in the next federal election here watch an incredible collective meltdown and brain explosion happening. Because, of course, that whole thing about national populism being a step away from national socialism is baking the political consciousness and, to a certain extent, the social consciousness here in Germany.
Well, I also think this highlights too, like, we have this idea of the populists, right? And that they're so different from the mainstream. And in a sense, I mean, we are seeing the cartel establishment parties that have been so solid for so long face threats that they didn't face even during times of much greater social conflict and, things looking worse for the system and all of that. But at the same time, I think Eatwell and Goodwin highlight this. Populists don't even have to succeed to do well, or to influence politics. Like I'm thinking about that in terms of Mexico a little bit, but like not everything has to have all the hallmarks of populism for populist features to emerge, right? So like these left-wing populists who aren't quite as populist as the right-wing populists or even mainstream parties, you can have these personality-driven politicians. I mean, Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris was an extremely personality-driven race in a lot of ways. That was not a policy race. So
that is sort of a feature of, I think, these modern populist parties too. They tend to be heavily centralized, personality-driven parties, but that's sort of the general trajectory of politics at large, really. It's almost inescapable now because that's sort of it's indicative, I think, the material decline of the parties as well. And as far as having links to society and what that does to what used to be more the core of the party at the grassroots level and lower institutional level, they become more centralized.
And a lot of the features of right-wing populism over the last 10 years have become less and less distinct to it, including heavily conspiratorial lines of thinking. I mean, that is an across-the-board feature of politics, especially in 2025. We really collapsed into it, but it's been a growing problem or trend. Who cares if it's a problem? It's a growing trend, really, in politics, is this orientation towards conspiratorial thinking that I think you can look at as a left, right, and center feature, right? And the same things goes for these personality-driven leaders.
And something I wanted to point out too is like when it comes to left-wing national populism, as we pointed out, Susha, Podemos, the Latin American populists, they're actually quite a bit more successful than we've seen in English-speaking countries in terms of left-wing populists. And that might have something to do with how they relate to national populism or how they relate to the themes, or really actually more how they relate to that theme of national sovereignty or popular sovereignty.
Yeah, I think that's right. Probably the reason that the left hasn't more generally gone in that direction is that there's a problem in the left, in that the left has increasingly lined up with the institutions that were going in the direction of sort of more, I don't want to use the word globalist because it doesn't really, I don't mean the same thing as the right-wing populists mean by it. But there's been this kind of lifting away from national civil societies. In Europe, so much of the left, including the radical left, thought that a free movement of workers within Europe was presaging a world where there was going to be true free movement of people across all borders, which it's proven to be not that, and now it's being wound back in certain ways as well. So I think there are all these things about the way that the left has developed during this long unraveling of the social basis of politics that has led it to cleave much more to those kinds of institutions that want to lift off from and detach themselves from national civil societies. And I think, Podemos is a really good example because once it doesn't have its breakthrough early on, it is tamed by the rest of the left. it sees its only way of surviving is to become part of the left. And then its kind of more nationalist elements get sapped out pretty quickly. Not that it's scared of using the nation state, like Podemos was part of the governments that did all the COVID lockdowns in Spain, and quite happily did that. It's not about the state, it's more about the national question. And the problem is because the right-wing populists are so on the nationalist bandwagon, more than the old centre-right, then the left-wing populists react against that, I think, and say, well, we're the anti-nationalists. And of course, nationalism equals racism. Nationalism equals National Socialism. These people are going to be fascists. Nationalism is part of fascism. You can see how in one's mind one can, in that very conspiratorial way, connect all the little dots on the pinboard.
So that actually brings me to another question. You're talking about Podemos, a left-wing populist party in power, but I want to talk about populists in power more generally, right? So is it a question of transformation or absorption or adaptation, right? Like, to start, well, you're mentioning fascism as well, right? Did classic fascism play on populist themes at all? Yes.
Mm.
I mean,
Mm.
of course it did. I mean, the Austrian, historic Austrian populism, which is like very different than what we see in populism today, it's worth stating, was important in the rise of fascism. And there were populist themes in a lot of fascist kind of regimes. There were populist themes in a lot of left-wing 20th century regimes as well. So what is populism's relationship to fascism? And then maybe we can talk about that question I was just raising about populism in power, because I have some thoughts there. But
I think I've come to the view now that the relationship between populism and fascism was a real one in the interwar period last century. Absolutely was a real relationship. People who ended up being attracted to some populist formations or some fascists end up using populist appeals. But that's a pretty thin understanding of what was going on. And in a sense, it's good that we talk on here about unpopular populism, Piping Shrug's term, because there's something very weird about this populism. This is a populism without a popular base. That's really important because I think populisms of the past did have popular bases. Even Huey Long, the famous Southern governor, was of Louisiana, wasn't it? He had a whole bunch of civic associations he could relate to in terms of having his populist base. Whereas today, the populists, like the old parties, lack a social base in the way that we've been talking about it here. So the relationship of populism today to fascism then is even more, is hugely distant because of the material fact, like an actual material fact about real institutions and real people organized in society, rather than just a matter of style. Because I've realized now that I've been reading Richard Evans's 3-volume history of the Nazis in Germany, and you realize that actually there are all these overlaps in terms of style between, the fascists, but also many other political formations. Your politicians use similar stylistic conceits. They played a different crowd. They played one crowd one day, another crowd the other day. They make populist appeals. We've seen, of course, the mainstream politicians, even of the cartel parties, the traditional parties, in the modern time, make populist appeals because that's a way to go over just sort of say, well, my party's not so important. I'm making a direct appeal to the people here. You don't have to worry about my party and its problems. So I think understanding that social base is really important. And the really big eye opener for me, apart from reading Evans, was reading Shari Berman wrote an article back in the 90s about civic associations in Germany during the rise of fascism. And her work's kind of been extended by Dylan Riley, who's one of the sort of the main writers at New Left Review, in a book on the civic foundations of interwar fascism, where he looked at Italy, Spain, and I think he looks at Romania as well. So, calling the Spanish and Romanian regimes fascist It's probably a bit of a stretch. He's chosen to do that, but they're, far-right regimes. But in all these examples, including the German example, there are these mass social bases, and the fascist parties kind of win over those social bases. They're existing social bases. They don't go and create a new social base out of nothing. These are social bases that were already there that the rest of the political class was relating to in various ways. In Germany, Shari Berman's article is really worth reading because she's kind of making a very controversial argument against people like Hannah Arendt, who said, well, fascism arose because there's this politics has become separated from the masses and people have become atomized, and the atomized person is attracted to fascism. And Shari Berman points out, materially, empirically, this is complete hogwash. Actually, it's the richness of civic associational life in Germany that is the basis on which the fascists recruit and win over huge numbers of people. They don't do so well in the trade unions, but they do very well in all kinds of clubs and associations. And Germany, it is the land of the Verein, the club. Unbelievable number of clubs and associations historically in Germany. And
Yeah,
they go in. Yeah. Please go on.
Sorry to interrupt, but it's like there is this theory today that the atomized individual is the basis for a renewed fascist threat. Whereas really what you see, the danger of the atomized individual, I mean, I think, when you think about mass shootings or things like that, I think a lot of times these things erupt from their inability to gain traction within any social group. It's actually the opposite, right? Like there's a frustration and the violence that emerges from the frustration in terms of, because there is no, if you have this right-wing ideology that is fringe, there really is no organized path to power.
Absolutely. And I guess it makes what happened in Germany and elsewhere in the interwar period so absolutely monstrous, but then more explicable, is that they really won over millions of people to an extremely radical solution to society's problems. Extremely radical, which is why you can have people turning their heads away and willing to tolerate the most horrific crimes in their names, because, at least there was a solution to the social crisis that Germany was in the 1930s. They were willing to give Hitler the break, but also they weren't just willing to give him the break because they voted for him once. Those votes were built on winning over large numbers of people who were already organized, socially connected with each other. One of the amazing statistics that not the Berman pulls out, there's been a more recent study about civic association based partly on her theory, done for the NBER, where they actually went through and calculated membership, because there's all this data available from Germany, interwar Germany, it's amazing. They calculated membership of these organizations. The people who recruited the most members to the Nazi party were people who were active members of at least 4 clubs. If you're a Nazi and you're only active in one club, your recruitment wasn't so great. If you were active in 4 clubs, you were a real networker. You could recruit all over the place, like out of proportion to how many clubs you were in. So the Nazis relied on these people who knew how to leverage actually existing social connections and be part of them, which this is like so different from the society that we have today, where we are so much more atomized, where club membership doesn't mean the same level of activity, where trade union membership, not only is it much smaller, much lower, it doesn't mean the same thing it used to mean. Which then goes to the question of, because some people will say, wasn't it great when all the parties had social bases? This was a better and more progressive time in society, where the ordinary people had more democratic control over society. And then you look at Germany and you say, well, having a social base in a capitalist society with a capitalist state and a capitalist political sphere ain't necessarily this amazing stabilizing thing. And that's one of the arguments that Berman makes against Arendt and that sort of school of thought is, don't think that civic institutions are going to protect you from democratic decline or democratic implosion.
So then I guess I can sort of hear the potential critique, are we saying meh, no problem to the, potential for right-wing populists to institute, nasty policies or something like that? Because I think we've disentangled it from fascism here. I mean, have leftists never appealed to the nation or to anti-elite sentiment, right? What about the billionaires, the oligarchs, no kings, all of that? That has a populist dimension to it.
Yeah.
But still, you could hear a kind of a critic saying, well, what is this just, why the apologism, why the downplaying? And I'm putting these in scare quotes here, but like,
Yeah.
do you
It's
know
a,
what I mean? I mean, it's I know it could seem a little bit moralizing, but I think it's worth addressing because it is something that causes people who are, I mean, I know people who are not political ideologues who are concerned about right-wing populism.
yes. I think there is something to be said for what is it that can stop things getting worse? Because that's really what people are talking about. You get into power a government that's going to make things worse for everyone. That National Rally will come in France and start deporting huge numbers of immigrants, or crack down on a particular type of activity, or Trump will set up alligator Alcatraz, or he'll pull actual citizens of the United States into the immigration raid, and they'll end up in camps in El Salvador before they can appeal. All of these things are real things. The problem that everyone faces is, well, how do we get a sense back of control over what the politicians do? And really, for most of the people who are very scared of right-wing populism, they believe the existing institutions will be that control and that check. The problem with the existing institutions, I think, is that the existing institutions do a lot of bad stuff. But if your perspective is the institutions are the only sort of rearguard protection that we have, then we need to mobilize institutions and be able to put it, like, if they lock us down during COVID, if they take away people's right to go into restaurants or to live their lives if they haven't had a vaccine, if they do all these things, we need to excuse that and find a justification for it, even though it's affected other people that we don't like so much, maybe. And it gets away from seeing the state and the political sphere as trying to manage a society that's largely combustible and out of control and internally divided and fissile and all that stuff. But how do we get control over things? And that's really the question. It's the question the populists of both right and left play on. Things feel out of control of the ordinary people. Of course, is it reasonable to say, well, the ordinary people are too dangerous because they're voting for these right-wing populists. So maybe their rights are going to have to be trampled on in order to save the sense of control that we've got. The problem is, over time, the vote for the right-wing populists gets larger and larger. The vote for the existing parties gets smaller. The old parties get smaller. And then what is your defense that the institutions have to end all parties? It's a serious question here in Germany. There is a serious discussion about whether or not the AfD should be banned as a right-wing extremist party that's too close to being another form of National Socialism. And we solve the question then. Will that really solve? Will the disenfranchisement of a large section of the population really solve the question?
Right. I mean, here in the United States, would putting Donald Trump in jail, would that be the end of these problems, or would that be the beginning of something else? Right.
Right.
Look at ways establishment parties around the world have tried to stop populism. I mean, you have a lot of speech restrictions. Obviously, Europe already has a less free speech friendly environment than the United States. A lot of legal suppression.
Speaking from Europe, I couldn't possibly agree with that.
Of course. But these things don't signal confidence in democracy, which, by the way, the demos in democracy is lost in all of these solutions to populism, right? Nobody's solution to populism in academia seems to be democratically oriented. These solutions don't signal much confidence in democracy. They signal party insecurity. So states are treating social media ad buys, okay, marketing as existential threat. Like the public is really this susceptible to brainwashing. I mean, in Romania, we have a canceled presidential election because, and hell, I wouldn't support Georgescu, but foreign ad spending from Russia is enough to overturn an election. Well, first of all, is that plausible that people are wouldn't there have to be some kind of fertile soil for any of that to matter? And then these bans and annulments, don't they just strengthen populist legitimacy? I mean, if the argument is the people have lost control of the institutions of democracy, and then the institutions of democracy start canceling elections, how does that stop populism?
I don't think it does in the longer term. It might if the existing parties had a huge social base and the populists didn't. You can imagine the sheer social weight of what was going on would make the populists go away, but no one's got a social base. And so then it just looks like state action. I guess it could get to the point where one of these institutional parties of the past does do something grossly undemocratic. It'll be dressed up as saving democracy, of course. You can. I just don't see how it stops this, because again, going back to the causes of this, the cause of this really is from the breakdown of the old party system and the inability. What the real loss of control that has gone on is not that people once had more control over society, because I think even in the high party era, people were not in control of society. During the post-war period, there's not much evidence that people could really control what governments were doing directly, but they were tied to organizations that were then tied to parties that then ruled the state. So they felt like there was a connection there. I think that's the difference. It felt like there was control, to the point when your party got in and betrayed your interests in the national interest, as left-wing, centre-left parties and Labour parties and social democratic parties did again and again. You would get so angry as a militant worker that your party of the unions had sold you out, and you felt so betrayed. And of course, you continued to vote for them, or maybe you voted against them one time out of anger. Then you came straight back to them, because after all, they're your party. The other party is not your party. People felt an ownership of these parties in some way. And I think that's what's gone on. I don't think people really feel control over the institutional parties. They just want someone to stop the right-wing populists. But the problem for all the parties is all of them have got unstable electorates, very changeable, very volatile voting patterns, simply because there is no social base to tie people through the ups and downs of betrayal and, delivery and whatever.
Well, to your point too, our friend David was talking about this a bit, but we always frame protest votes in terms of the populists, right? So you're protest voting against the establishment to the populists. I mean, why haven't the populists been more successful faster? I don't think people are voting for the establishment institutional parties, to your point, because they think they're very well represented by it. I don't think, if you looked at the Democratic Party in a vacuum, aside from Donald Trump, I don't think a lot of their core voters feel that great about the party right now. But it's almost a protest vote for the establishment against the populist, is sort of where that lands. But, if I can critique populism a little bit here, right, if we can talk about populism in power, this is a whole thing about participation and control that we're bringing up. But is participation restored when populists take power? I mean, if they don't have a social base and they don't really, an interesting part, populists appeal to the idea of anti-politics, which is a broader phenomenon. But there's very little in the way of term limits, real constraints on political class privileges, any kind of structural reform actually getting anything out of the so-called deep state in terms of big secrets that are revealed is obviously not very fruitful. Even when you have, Donald Trump coming in with a kind of sense of vengeance against the intelligence agencies, I mean, there has really been quite not a lot of, and you've got Tulsi Gabbard, who, Tulsi Gabbard was put on a watch list by the intelligence agencies, and now she's in charge at DNI. You would think we'd find out about, whatever the current day MK Ultra is or something, but no. I mean, there's very little delivered in terms of any of those things. So, if participation isn't restored, like, what is the goal of right-wing populism? What's the project? What do they want besides their own entrenchment as a new political class? Because, I mean, socialism ostensibly has a goal, fascism ostensibly has a goal. What's populism trying to do?
If you listen to J.D. Vance, who I think is, I guess, one of the theorists from within, it is to restore. He's arguing that this is a superior form of democracy, the populist form. That you vote for a leader. Well, I mean, Trump wants to get rid of the filibuster. That's something. I think he wants the sense that once you've got 50% plus one votes, that person should go and be able to enact their entire mandate. And that is the thing that guarantees the connection of the people. We've elected the leader will carry out what we want. Because the other system with parties that do deals and have to broker things and you're constantly deadlocked isn't working. That, their internal factional structures prevent the people's will being met because they go off on tangents or whatever. Or they become internally focused. So I think there's a sense amongst the populist ideologues that that's how populism solves the problem, because at least there is this: the people exert their will through the ballot box. The leader then goes and carries out the program they voted for. I think that's an important part of the appeal. In reality, though, what is the social base for doing more than governing the state as it is? Because ultimately, the question of can you have something more radical comes from whether you have a social force that's more radical. And otherwise, you inhabit a political sphere that shapes you like it shapes all other politicians. You stand above society, facing society, and yet somewhat antagonistic to society. You have to administer society. That's your job day to day, is you have to administer society. And then, of course, there's an external function, that you have to manage your relations with other states and other political classes. So that's the job. Your job shapes you. Your social reality shapes you. What social mechanism, power, force, weight is there to do something different? So, both times now, I know that after David sometimes talks about the possibility of Trump having been more of an anti-politician in power, more vicious against his enemies, or finding a way to better split the existing politicians and mess things up for them. Actually, I think he is necessarily a victim of his social circumstances. He can't help but be shaped by them. He can't magically rise above that. I think that's old. And then the populists who have staying power are the ones who figure out a formula that wins enough sort of voter groups to keep voting for them. And there's often a lot of pork barreling, a lot of targeting specific groups and providing them with state aid.
I mean, to some of what you're saying, right? You look at how governance shapes these parties. I mean, reform has poached some of the old conservatives as they start to rise. National Rally, Marine Le Pen in France, we think of, and obviously there is a right-wing element undeniably to National Rally, but you think about their history, Okay. I mean, these are like, it's like seeing skinheads go to being like, they have like families at a book club. I mean, maybe clubs isn't the right way to think of it, but the Le Pen's history is she actually had to kick out her own father from National Rally to even make the party palatable to voters. So if we're arguing, and this is going back to just relitigating that thing about is populism fascism, well, why would fascism have to kick out the fascist, right? Like, no, right-wing populism is obviously a different adaptation.
Because they have a secret plan, despite being a large party that is running election after election debates on television. There is a very, very secret plan, so people say, to really, once they get into power, to suddenly do what Hitler did.
There's a relationship what is the relationship between populism and democracy versus the relationship between the old parties and democracy, and the relationship between fascism and democracy? I think that actually answers a lot of the core of people's anxieties around populism, especially national populism.
Well,
And that's a big topic.
I think of our friend Otto Kirchheimer, right? And his idea of opposition of principle, right? Like the fascist parties were opposed in principle to like the existence of that political system and to any other party being in a democratic relationship with themselves. I don't see that as a feature of right-wing populism, no matter how sort of into the friend enemy kind of way of thinking about politics they may be. But what else were you getting at, Joe?
Yeah, actually, that's something I've wanted to unpack myself, actually, when it comes to like how the populists act. To what extent are they acting as oppositions in principle? I don't see them as wanting to overthrow the state, but they do seem more willing to sort of play with disrupting some core aspects of the state, maybe.
And they're willing to box out. They're willing to box out the cartel establishment like completely in the way the cartel establishment was willing to box out third-party contenders and things like that.
Right. And even like when it comes to like what Tal was saying about Trump wanting to, and I guess the new populist right in the United States, at least its intellectuals want, is to, as Vance was saying, it almost seems like they want to sort of cast off classic Madisonian democratic checks and balances for a sort of tribune president, really. The one that gets elected and he just power drives his program forward, which, that does, obviously that would freak out any opposition. But in a weird way, though, it isn't actually as different from how the old political establishment has been acting for a while anyway, because the executive has gotten stronger in the United States because the parties have gotten weaker. And it's not that maybe this is more, maybe it's seen in a more systematic way here.
Yeah, I do see something kind of threatening about what's going on in some ways, like the violation of constitutional norms, but that goes back to George W. Bush. That goes back to like there's, or maybe not the violation of constitutional norms itself being the threatening thing, but that you can actually just have no laws change and just the enforcement of the laws changes. I think COVID's a great example of that, where, there were things that a lot of what was done during COVID could be legal if you legislated it, but it was not actually legislated at any point. And so just the interpretation of laws changes. I do want to just touch on, I don't want to go too far into it, but Tad, you mentioned this feeling of the constraints around Trump. And I want to ask, because I've always been curious a little bit about your perspective on this. Do you see, though, a distinction between Trump and the Trumpists, right? Like the kind of new political class layer that has emerged around Donald Trump. And because to me, right, like when I think about, could Trump be doing more to be disruptive?
Yeah, I think he is different. I mean, he is a unique politician in some senses. Of all the anti-politicians we've seen in the West, in the rich West, over the last 20 years, he's like the purest anti-politician, the one who's been most vicious about the rest of the political class, who is so openly spoken about himself as not a politician. Like it's been really, and I think his ideological flexibility, he's only got a few core beliefs that he repeats over, and they've been pretty stable, really. You can say he's quite rigid about some things, but everything else really is flexible. Um, I think I think he is unusual. I think he's got now a political class around him, or at least a core group who have a whole bunch of different viewpoints, which I think he likes. I think that's his corporate history as well, as he liked having different advisors giving different viewpoints, and then he would adjudicate on which viewpoint to go with. And then everyone would have to be on board for that. But it seems like he's a very careful listener and uh, takes stock of what lots of different people say. So I think he's got that around him, but whether they together could replace him, once he's gone, whether they can, together be the one Donald Trump, or whether they're just going to tear themselves to shreds is a different question. I think the more important thing is going back to the cartel. The existing parties have had a cartel. Donald Trump smashed half of that cartel and brought the other half of the cartel to its knees over this period of time. In a sense, it is a kind of still a cartel system, but it's a cartel system that's no longer got that. There is a duel at the heart of it. There is an opposition at the heart of the American political system. Whether you call it, I don't think it's an opposition of principle, but there is an opposition of, the populist versus the anti-populist now. Whereas in the past, there are essentially two non-populist formations that disagreed on various policies and could be nasty to each other and were deadlocked in various ways, but worked with each other to maintain their, shared privileges and shared traditions and so on. I think the cartels are going to get smashed, and we're going to go back. My feeling is we're going to have far more unstable party systems, and we may see other things other than traditional legacy parties or technocrats or populists. There may yet be new variations we haven't even thought of and can't conceive of until someone conceives of them. Because in the end, there is this tension between the political sphere and civil society that I guess comes out in different ways, and people can try to leverage support and become scavengers, for gaps that emerge, for oppositions that emerge in that. That's kind of my gut feel. Though I don't think the populist style is exhausted. What is for sure, I think, is that a large number of these formations will have an anti-political tinge to them.
Does the cartel system sort of, I guess it hinges on stability that doesn't seem to be there anymore.
Yeah, it hinged on two things. First of all, that the parties increasingly became more tied to the state than they were to society. So that gap had opened up between them. They withdrew from society as society receded from them. That's one side of it. And so therefore they were closer to the state, and they had shared interest in managing the state, even if they were opposed in terms of policy. And the second thing, though, I think about that distance between society and the state, because of the breakdown of those social institutions and their withering away, that's really important. If for a period of time, it could have seemed to the cartel parties that actually society is not such a problem because it's so distant. All we have to do is run the state. And we're just now going to do it at a distance from society. For all the talk about, the anxiety about democracy breaking down because of the breakdown of these social institutions and so on, and the crisis of democracy that was identified in the 1970s, actually political classes got pretty comfortable with it pretty quickly, because they could say, well, we just have to find ways to adapt, to restabilize ourselves. And if we're not responsive to society, so what? Now, of course, that's now broken down, and they realize, whoops, there's a problem here, which I think is like the phase that we're in now. But of course, their solution isn't we need to get closer to society. I think that's long distance, that's gone. Even J.D. Vance doesn't talk about. He talks about society in a strange way, like he talks about it as being very distant from where he is. but he wants to find some compact between the state and those animal citizens. He did a very interesting speech a few months ago about citizenship and, who is an American citizen and what is the reciprocal relationship between the state and the citizen. Yeah. So I guess those they did find some stability, but it was always going to be tenuous.
That does sound very relevant to actually why populism has or at least national populism has taken off. Actually, that I guess now there actually is even an intellectual understanding now of I guess that compact between the state and its citizenship that Vance is talking about. It's actually interesting that he's lasered in on it, I think, as extensively as he has. It does seem like he's trying to sort of create a basis for the post-Trump Republican Party. Actually, what are they going to be saying after him? Once Trump is gone, they don't have the sort of ideologically flexible disruptor anymore. So what can they do after that? And it has to be talking about that relationship, because it's so much at the core of the tension between politics and society that we're seeing today. And I don't think it's because Vance is an anti-politician, but I think it's more that he is, I guess he has become an ideological right populist, and he's trying to ensure that is a project that survives. And maybe he has lasered in to some extent on how it could survive.
He's quite flexible, though. He is ideological, but his trajectory indicates in his political self-interest, he's been very flexible. I think he's trying to come up with a theory. If you look at his response to the Nick Fuentes controversy that is dogging the upper echelons of the Republican sort of milieu, or the MAGA milieu, his intervention's very interesting. He both trashes Nick Fuentes, but then says we can't be so ideologically rigid that we start, creating purity tests. But I think he's learned a certain amount of flexibility. So he's an interesting character. I think that always comes back to this question of sovereignty. Ultimately, what is the real material basis for the sovereignty of the state and of the political class? The state and the political class like to believe that the real basis for the sovereignty of the state and the political class is the state and the political class. The problem is that they actually only exist because of the civil society on which they are built and which they manage. So ultimately, the question of popular sovereignty just returns in different forms again and again and again. This is really important, I think. And the national populists, I think, are better at it. And I get a sense in the United States, the Republican Party's had problems for a long time. And the end result was that the intellectuals inside the Republican Party came to conclusions quicker than the intellectuals of the left did. But possibly, again, it's simply a function of the left buried itself in the institutions when its social bases disappeared. They found other progressive institutions in which to bury themselves. And so their viewpoint, they couldn't go back to the demos. They couldn't do it. I'm speculating, though. These are the big questions of our time, right?
And that actually, I think that gets back to the book too, even because one thing I found striking about it is it's a very rich book. It has a lot of great history in it too, a lot of decent data too. But part of me wonders if it's about 70% correct and about 30% wrong. And I think it's because they see populist drivers as these 4Ds: distrust, deprivation, destruction, de-alignment. And so they take anti-politics seriously. They take the de-alignment of the public from the political class and the traditional political parties seriously. But I think what I wonder about is how does it read too ideologically onto the public that votes for populists with deprivation and destruction? Maybe the cores of a lot of these, the cores of these parties, as far as these parties have any cores whatsoever, but the people that supported them first, perhaps, maybe it applies to them first, whether they see themselves as being relatively deprived compared to other groups, whether or not they're not getting ahead, or they're concerned
Okay.
about.
Yeah, if I could just give like a quick, before you answer, a quick deprivation and destruction, right? The 4 Ds. Deprivation is stagnancy in quality of life relative to other groups. That's how Eatwell and Goodwin define it. So, according to the book, populist voters see their fortunes as disadvantaged compared to other groups, see the future as bleak, and they have this statistic about Brexit support among being low among voters who saw themselves as doing better than others. And for those who felt that things had gotten a lot worse for them compared to other people, it was 76% support for Brexit. So these statistics they come up with, I mean, they are interesting. And so that's deprivation. And then destruction is this idea of national culture being wiped out by immigration and political correctness. But they also, I don't want to caricature Eatwell and Goodwin on this. They also cite places like Hungary and Poland, which haven't had major demographic, ethnic changes relative to Western Europe that have populist sentiment around national culture being wiped out and things like that. So, Joe, I didn't mean to interrupt you there. I just wanted to provide
That was clarifying. Yeah.
a little more definitional clarity around. We know what distrust is. We know what de-alignment from the party system is. What do they mean by deprivation? What do they mean by destruction? And that's stagnancy in quality of life and national culture being wiped out. So, and that raises all these questions. Are drivers the right framework if we don't think they have a social base?
It's a good question. The data on deprivation, obviously they did a lot on the Brexit vote, which was an unusual vote because it was a yes/no question. There weren't multiple parties to vote for. So it doesn't tell you as much about the rise of potential right-wing populist parties. And it was a very narrow vote. Obviously, there was, only I think tens of thousands of votes in it. So it's a bit harder to read off that. If you look at the data, for example, around Trump in 2016, the data is very contradictory. I think there is certainly a sense that comes through more clearly that people who believe there's national decline or things are going to get worse do tend to vote for these parties more. But then you have to start to ask the question in this hyper-political age, is it that their disdain for the political system leads them to read the situation more generally worse? Because then when you look at people's actual data in terms of wage directions and things like that, it doesn't always match up. So I think the reality economically is a lot messier. And certainly my research into the Trump phenomenon, where it's clear Hillary Clinton's thesis was clear. There were two groups of Trump voters, essentially. There were the deplorables who had all these horrible nationalist races to be used. I guess the people, the destruction people. And then there were the desperates, the people who were desperate, the other half of Trump's voters, who were the ones who were in economic trouble. But both of these actually lined up quite poorly. The electorates for these parties extend well beyond this. It is true to say, though, any new party that comes along that has a program and makes certain arguments will first attract people, everything else being equal, who agree with those arguments in that program and their style of intervening. So the initial group, the more hardened group of voters, they will have had to, first of all, be willing to give up on the major party, on the old parties. And secondly, of course, they're more likely to vote for reform if they already agree with parts of its agenda. But as the old parties break down more, the electorate becomes more diverse. Hence, you have the confounding of each of Trump's three electorates, 2016, 2020, and 2024, become progressively more ethnically diverse, less white, more working class, interestingly, probably over time, but continue to have a very messy mix of different groups inside them. It's really hard to read off one clear, like the fine-grained stuff that's really useful to look at. But people are attracted to Trump still, like they are to old parties, partly because of their program and their message and what issues they play on. And that's all still true. The big question is, why would people leave the safety of a more traditionally organized party like the Democrats for this crazy rogue, taken over by Donald Trump party, which is on its way to fascism. Why would ordinary people vote for this? And it's a question we keep circling towards. My argument is there's more scavenger in this than anything else. The anti-politics, the word the prefix anti says something. This is largely a negative phenomenon. And therefore, scavengers will be effective when they play on the negation, on the negativity. They will be successful when they play on what's wrong with the other side. What's wrong with the political system? Why isn't it delivering for you? And then as those other parties, for material reasons, lose their grip on their electorates, these parties can... So there's no way that there has been a rise in semi-hidden fascist sentiment in the huge rise in the National Rally vote. It's kind of the last people standing, aren't they? In a way, Macron saved the political system. They could have won earlier. National Rally could have won earlier if Macron had quite brilliantly found that little gap in the system as all the other mainstream parties were collapsing. Back in 2017, I think it was, that he won. There's this mix of these two things. And so the electorate then for this group of people, for the national populists, becomes a much more varied electorate. It's not that people have been won over to their ideology. It's clear how quickly people have peeled off Donald Trump's support base since November last year, how his more extreme pandering to his hardened base has caused him problems electorally since then. This is important, and the successful national populists find a way to juggle all these different groups they bring together to gain more election victories, I think. But it's not like there's no evidence of this mass ideological move, and which is why all the analysts of populism who talk about the move to the right in the population and the move towards more radical right-wing ideas and attitudes very rarely can point to any empirical data.
You point to something interesting there too. Sorry. I think you get at the messiness of it actually, because I feel like if there is one of the shortcomings of the book, I think with Ian and Goodwill is that I think that they might overrate their pudding when they talk about how much people are voting for these parties and these figures rather than against the existing order. They say that explicitly too in the book too, and I think that's true to an extent actually. But I think it might actually understate the extent to which people aren't signing on to every single checklist of every that these parties and these figures provide. I'm not sure that's ever really been the case, really.
I would put a very fine nuance on it, which I think is very useful. Morris Fiorina talks about this in terms of the American party system. Of course, everyone has said for a very long time that the American politics is more and more polarized, and therefore American society is more and more polarized, extreme right and extreme left. When you look at American social attitudes, they maintain the same annoying bell curve for a very long period of time, except for a few issues. People are mostly in the center. There's some people at the extreme. You look at them, the party activists, hardliners, donors, and politicians, they're much more on opposite poles with a big gap in the middle. But when you are a voter and you walk into the polling booth and you have to vote, and there are two choices before you, you don't just vote against, some people just vote against the one they don't want. But you vote for the one who kind of, if you think is closer to where you think things want to go, even if they're a really long way from where you want to go. And that's really important insight, I think, that people are still voting for these national populists. There is no question they're voting for them, but they're not voting for them in the sense that the ideologues think they are. Yes, I've signed up to the Nazi Party platform and now I'm about to start organizing gas chambers for Jews. It is not like that at all, which is again another difference between the interwar period, where huge numbers of people in the population were not just socially connected to these parties, they were invested in those parties' programs, in transforming society in the direction. It was a completely different period of time. And now we have a prolonged period of increasing distance from that kind of, even though people might hold ideas in their heads, our
Yeah,
national lab.
that is a very important aspect of understanding mass politics too. It was the extent to which society was actually very invested in these projects actively. That was part of their lives. And we don't really get that now. Going to a rally every couple of years is not the same thing. Voting isn't quite the same thing. But no, I think that really gets at it great too. I do think I wonder if Ian Goodwell maybe might take some of the data a little too at face value without thinking to themselves, what's actually going on here? Because I think they're talking about a poll, for instance, that was sort of divvying up Trump voters, for instance, right? So I think it was a Q poll. He was talking about how here's an interesting section. They talk about the most loyal Trump supporters, preservationists. Fiercely pro-Trump voters usually had only some high school education and lived in low-income households that earned less than $50,000 each year. They had more in common with other elements that were the two other elements that were key to his victory. The anti-elites, who tend to be better off or were profoundly unhappy with the status quo, and the disengaged, the smaller demographic that knew little about politics but turned out just so they could vote for Trump. The preservationists, they sound like it's sort of the same people that were concerned about the destruction that they talked about beforehand. But here's the thing: you can't really divide. It's almost like they're trying to divide a huge swath of voters into factions, and it doesn't really cleanly describe how people relate to politics for the most part. Most people don't. You don't really have you don't have 10 ideologies in the United States that most people will cleanly subscribe to. Really, most people have mixed views. Most people don't only prioritize a couple of things. Really,
Yeah, I think like there are all kinds of. There's an effort in the UK called More in Common who do this. They split up the voting public into 8 or 9 groups. It's a fascinating exercise. It does start to get at some of this difference between the highly politically engaged and others, which is really important, I think. So, for example, they found the people who are highly politically engaged on the left in the UK are the most likely to be like really nasty to other people and never forgive, political transgression. So then they find most likely to stick the knife into friendships over. They painted a not very flattering picture of them. So these are useful things to try to understand that the electorate is not just the right wing and the left wing. But I agree there are pretty severe limitations to it. The dominant faction of society is those with a relatively low or sometimes almost non-existent level of engagement with politics. Who are not super invested, who may or may not vote, depending on the particular society. This is still like a major group, and the distance between the huge number of them who really are a majority of society and the members of the political class, activists, donors, apparatchiks, politicians, the distance between those people is like dramatic, much more dramatic in many ways than the differences of opinion within the political class. So that remains like the major split in society. But almost all political commentators don't see it that way. Even if they do see the de-alignment and distrust like Eatwell and Goodwin do, you have the situation where ultimately they kind of see still the ideology of the party is reflecting something in society. For sure, the questions of sovereignty and migration tied to that are really important questions that keep coming up, because it's one of the ways that politicians can leverage the question of a missing sovereignty, I think. And in Europe, perhaps even easier to do with the EU. So you look at all that kind of stuff, you can see why those issues get leveraged and why they're so useful. But whether there's a groundswell of there isn't really a movement for or against migration or for a certain level of migration and against another. Just like there really wasn't anything more than a very transient movement about Black Lives Matter in 2020. These things, there are explosions and then they fizzle. And in terms of the party system, there's an erosion of the old parties and a rise of new challenges, and a much more messy situation there as well. But going back to Grant's question, which is really important, are we just being too sanguine here and sitting around going, don't worry about this? I could see both existing institutional parties and right-wing populist parties getting into power and enacting horrible policies. And then the question will be, how much social passivity is there towards that? And at what point do these parties, whichever sort of party they are, cross some line? For example, create a new green tax that sets off the yellow vests movement in France, which wasn't, I think, a more sustained social movement, even if it was a minority social movement. At some point, whoever's in power will end up provoking something socially. And all the rest of the time, they're desperately trying to manage things so they don't have to. Or being complacent about how passive society is.
So that is the future, if that's inevitable? I
Well,
mean, nobody in politics should have a crystal ball, but I'll speak for maybe I'll put my neck
okay.
on the maybe I'll put my neck on the chopping block. I think so.
Joe, are you willing to bet on a social revival or not?
It's hard to say, isn't it? I think the thing is, I don't see this antagonism between politics and civil society going away. It seems to only be accelerating. And I think that the fact and that antagonism always seems to get sharper. I don't know what's going to come out of that exactly, but I think it has to force some type of movement in society eventually. That or
Credit your skepticism, though. I mean, there has been already, I think in the secular movement almost of the withdrawal from politics of society has been a kind of, it's had its own effects, right? Like letting politics fall through an open door has done its own progressive work, so to speak. So I don't know, what will society find more? I think it does depend, like Tad was saying, on, is there something that crosses a line politically, that politics does, that crosses a line for society? And that's a question of what politics does. But I do think that things like the yellow vests point to that there are such lines, that they do exist.
right, and it's not that there aren't like square movements that pop up constantly. We've seen quite a few of those actually in the last year. They're hard to, but it's hard to predict them actually, I think.
And it's hard to see them
I don't
in
think
the
it
West.
can.
Yeah, and they're rare in the West as well, right?
And there's been this sweeping, they're so-called Gen Z protests. I doubt they actually are only Gen Z people, but there's these Gen Z protests, Nepal, all of these places they're interesting. But yeah, that's a whole other subject. But we've seen in some Western democracies, we have seen in the past, we have seen things that resemble social movements.
So ultimately, political classes have to try to administer society and manage it in various ways. And clearly, social contradictions haven't gone away. There's a million social contradictions even politicians are willing to talk about. So they haven't gone away, and they're trying to manage them. At some point, of course, politicians could do some pretty wild things to manage a social contradiction, including one that might come up unexpectedly or may come at the end of a long chain of decisions that have been made. Like the lead up to the First World War and the Second World War they weren't just about politicians wanting to have wars. There were underlying social and economic contradictions that led to those things. That formed the basis, even if ultimately there were political decisions made. It is possible that one of those contradictions leads somebody to want to have a good war and solve their problems. Like this stuff doesn't necessarily lead to happiness and joy. I think we've seen now, anti-politics doesn't just lead to exciting throwing out of legacy politicians. It also leads to pedophilia panic crises for political class. It leads to all kinds of ugly outcomes. But interestingly, even there, I just seen some fascinating data from Germany. Since 2016, the Leipzig authoritarianism study has been following the question of that they try to have some questions that assess people's conspiratorial thinking. And it's been in decline since 2016, with a small blip up in 2022 after COVID and then back down to its lowest level yet. So even
it's a hard time. It's a hard time to be a democracy scholar, isn't it?
Yeah. It's crazy because, like, of course, conspiratorial thinking amongst politicos has never been greater in my experience. I've just never seen so much conspiratorial stuff going on. I suspect if they did similar studies in the US, they may find, well, I think there have been some polls that indicate the interest in the Epstein saga is way less amongst ordinary people than is amongst the highly politically engaged. So that there's all these things that even sometimes we think, oh God, this is a terrible outgrowth of anti-politics. And actually it's kind of only going on in the elite sphere and they're battling it out. But of course, a battle in the elite sphere could be enough to start a war. The question is there the same social basis for doing that? Does the national interest in national polity have the same social basis? Could you sustain a war in the same way? Trump is being very careful about not putting boots. He's he's willing to bomb some people occasionally. He's very tentative about even all the stuff in Latin America. You can see how he's trying to grapple with the knowledge that, trying to do too much could all go to hell for him politically and for his legacy particularly. So, and those are serious things. If the US really is retreating to just its own kind of specific American hemisphere, and then trying to form alliances outside that rather than be the hegemon, that could lead to things blowing up as well. So you just don't know what's going to happen. I'm not willing to make a prediction about when it's going to happen next, but I feel for sure it's going to happen next. And the question is, can people orient that, or is it going to fizzle out, or are people going to be able to convince that social movement that really what you need to do is to be more political? And there was an entire book, I think it might have been called The Fire Last Time, a recent book by a journalist.
Bevins?
Yeah, I read that book, and his whole argument is we've had these explosive movements. The problem with everyone is they should have built, essentially he's kind of saying they should have built a party, though less radical than a Leninist party. But every single one, there should have been a party, they should have engaged with the state and taken over the state. That seems to be his argument, because ultimately that's the only serious way to do things. They were too anti the state and anti-politics.
It's interesting too, because I think you mentioned that Bevins, that book kind of collapses basically every protest wave that's happened in the last, 10 or 15 years. There's a lot of problems with that, for one, because again, it gets to what you're talking about with the highly politically engaged and the rest of society. There's an antagonism there, and I think that they go out in the streets for very different reasons. So that's one that is a major difference, I think, between different types of protests. But I think the other thing too is that when you do have protests that involve more of the general public that isn't politically engaged or feels antagonistic towards politics in general, asking them to engage politically, well, that's a problem. They're not really willing to do it.
Yeah.
This is the point to make them, they're to demand us to. So, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I think this is one of the problems with that argument is that it presumes that there could have been this kind of corralling into the political that it just could have been made to happen, right? And that's a big presumption. Was there actually the substrate for this? I'm just trying to remember. I know that the choice he makes is not to look at any movements in the West. So the yellow vests, Syriza and Podemos, or Spain and Greece, don't really feature. I can't remember whether Tahrir Square is in that book or not, whether the book starts a little bit after that. But whether you can corral it into politics in the sense that he means that I'm not really sure. I think the problem is that there hasn't really been a very clear view about what to do about politics in the state. That is one of the things that's missing. The idea that society could organize itself differently to look after its own needs, which is kind of the question at the heart of Marx in the end, once he comes to the question of communism, and then particularly with the Paris Commune. But before that, it's really, how does the working class organize itself to not have to be part of the political state? Like, can society be organized differently? Because he's talking about a social revolution. He's not just talking about reaching in to have a much more democratic state with the existing social relations, something far more profound. And I suspect, like obviously in each of these movements, there have been discussions about this stuff. And there's always prefigurative forms people try to create, but often they don't go very far. The real question is, will there be one of these social uprisings with enough force that actually starts challenging the way society is organized? You would think that the one period, the periods in which that's happened in the past where it's gotten that far, it's usually been with a crisis of the existing order, where the existing order can't really manage itself anymore. So it's almost like someone has to take control of the situation differently because the existing control mechanisms have fallen apart. And I wonder whether we're heading towards that, but not in the old sense of capitalists versus workers. I think more in the sense of the state finding some sort of crunch point where it can't manage things anymore, just runs out of levers to pull. Got a lot of levers, but ultimately the state still is based on the society. But in the end, like you can say, well, the state can just keep spending as much as it wants. Well, we saw that in COVID. Modern monetary theory was brought to life accidentally during COVID, where the state just threw money, and probably the central banks much more than the state itself, the governments themselves, threw all the money at this problem. And the outcome was a period of more instability caused by high inflation, and all the fallout from that. And now even as inflation has come down, everyone's perceiving that inflation is still really high. Like, it's really interesting. Like, here we have what seems to be really hot growth in the United States. Inflation's down to where it used to be, during Trump's first term. Trump can't catch a break from it. Like, people start to see it that way. So it's created a whole new, so even now the state has kind of managed the economic problem back into its box, and yet people aren't giving politicians the credit for it. So, those levers stop being effective. So it could be quite interesting how things play out, but I'm only speculating because I think if anything comes out of all this stuff we've been talking about for a very long time, is we are in such a radically different era. We're not going to see a replay of the left's greatest hits and the radical left's greatest hits. We're going to see something very radically different. And I suspect that most people on the left, when they see it, will be appalled by what happens. They'll want to rein it in at best or destroy it at worst. It would be too threatening for their worldview.
It gets at the reaction to the yellow vests too, I think, which the left was not entirely all that. They weren't very hot on it. Some were,
Right.
but largely there was a lot of skepticism. And I think any social movement now is going to be responded to with a lot of fear or concern in politics, really across the spectrum. And I think even by populists, actually, which might even get to, I guess, getting back to right-wing populism. Where does it go from here, really? I guess we talk about like how they have to govern pragmatically and moderate the rhetoric and preserve state forms when they're in power. But how are populists going to deal with this mess? Because it seems like everything is kind of falling in their hands now. And who knows how they're going to do it, right?
Well, to your point, right? Le Pen went to the yellow vest, and of course,
the left was first and foremost, the left was appalled by the yellow vests, but Le Pen went to the yellow vests and was a little bit appalled too, because there were people shouting down with capitalism at it. So
Yeah,
the more everyone is turned off in politics by something, maybe the more interesting it'll end up becoming.
I think the other thing is that the moderation is partly to get into power as well, because that's the trajectory of some of the more hard right people like Le Pen. In power, there is again another contradiction that makes it hard to then govern moderately, which is that you do rely on a core base. You see it with Trump very clearly. He feels like he can't really betray the core base, and they're clearly much more ideologically rigid and want much more, retribution and all the rest of it. But actually to do well, he would have to move to the left and the center. So he has to play this game of trying to hold on to the core and then finding a way to reach across the aisle. But the pressure, because he is so detached from society, the pressure will be great to go along with what his much narrower base really wants. Because you look at things, the Nazis are very different. They had like a real social base. But even the Nazis with this mass social base, as the general German population became felt more and more detached from them over time, and their policies and their war policy, especially once the war starts going badly, the more they radicalize, the more they want to carry through the final solution, be as radical as possible. And I think essentially the pressure is very internal. They have to keep their shock troops, those people who joined 10 clubs and recruited all those members who are the hardline fanatics. You have to keep them happy because they hold the show together. So there's all these different pressures as well, whether you've got a big social base that you're now losing your grip on, or whether you don't have much of a base. You end up looking to this, which explains why could Joe Biden, a moderate right-wing Democrat, why couldn't he break away from some of the crazy left-wing stuff in the party? Because the groups and the donors, they are committed to those ideologies. They were more committed to those ideologies. People want to blame Biden as inner circle. They were kind of existing within a larger democratic pool, and I think creates those kinds of contradictory pressures. So I don't think it's easy. And you'll get people like Orban in Hungary, he was very lucky. There was a complete collapse of all the other parties to small numbers. So even when they united together, they looked like a rebel. So he could rely on that for a while. But as soon as one of his former supporters breaks away, suddenly Orban's under considerable electoral pressure because there's an alternative, someone else who can read the tea leaves enough to figure out how to get under his skin.
Right, and there's probably an anti-political dimension to that too, really, because this is not something from the old establishment. This something from his old, that's from his old party that is hitting him on corruption. That's actually pretty potent, and it almost makes you wonder, like, this might actually be a problem for populists or for governing populists that run long in the tooth. You could probably see stuff like that happen to them as well.
Ultimately, there'll be a different purity test, maybe not the one that J.D. Vance is warning against, the ideological one. But there are always, politics is full of purity tests now. In some ways, despite everyone screaming corruption at Trump, he seems less corruptible than the existing political class because it was part of a corrupt cartel in that, like, if you want to take the extreme viewpoint of it. So he appears to be the clean skin because he's directly channeling the will of the people. Then his supporters can excuse some of his, questionable actions. But easily people can point to his corruption. Maybe one of the things Vance has to do is to distance himself from Trump, which, Kamala Harris couldn't distance herself from Biden, and that was a disaster. How do you distance yourself? How do you, does there have to be a fight inside the party again to renew yourself? Like, these are all questions that populists are going to deal with.
Do you think Marjorie Taylor Greene's gone forever?
She'll be back in some form, I suspect, but I'm not sure what game she's playing. It's currently she's burning as many of her useful bridges as she can, I think.
Fair enough.
I mean, maybe she wants to run for the Democrats.
Maybe she really believes. Maybe she really. Wait. Marjorie Taylor Greene is a Democrat.
Well, look at who she's been cuddling up to, CNN and um, you know,
Wow. Yeah. I had to think about that. Man.
she's having her big come to Jesus moment. You see, she's apologizing for her past behavior. She's got that look in her eyes.
I wonder if she. Yeah. I wonder if she really believes that that the Epstein stuff will take Trump down. Maybe she really does believe it. What do you think, Grant?
Yeah.
I don't know, but at least anything to save me from a Newsom Vance race, I'll get behind.
Although it's interesting too, though, because like I feel like maybe this kind of even gets at like there are similarities or weird like maybe there are similarities between populism and the old mainstream parties, and we're starting to see them emerge more now that populism is in the ascent. There are things that they agree on more, and their behavior is similar too. We even see this weirdly enough with the Epstein stuff.
Well, I think there's something where they aren't able to do the vote-seeking types of strategies of the catch-all parties from immediately after World War II. Like, because the catch-all parties were a precursor to the cartel parties, the catch-all parties could really grab lots of votes from different places, whereas I think that vote-seeking has sort of degenerated in the way that the cartel parties, like so few people are rusted onto politics that even the ability to be a catch-all party is sort of disrupted. And so even the ability of populists to like occupy certain representation gaps, it creates other representation gaps for them.
Catch-all parties had the advantage that they had a social base. It might have been minoritarian, or it may have been a couple of social groups that were at the core, and then they went looking for the other votes. That's the difference. They still had an institutional base. What we have now is not like it's Bill Maher, the comedian, talks about how Trump's very clever. He's legalizing marijuana because, of course, this is the way he's going to grab another. He sees it very much as like Trump knows how to have weird positions on things to get different social groups to vote for him that wouldn't normally vote for him in public, which there's a certain truth to that, but it's not the same as the catch-all party because there's no central stable base at the heart of it. There's nothing there. It's all Trump's project is as hollow as the cartel parties. It's more interesting in the cartel parties because it's new and because it's disruptive.
Trump does have this motley coalition, basically, and it gets at like what we were talking about with Goodwin and Eatwell, actually. I think that they do overrate their putting on how ideological the public actually is. And in all reality, you can even see this in like the weird coalition that Trump wound up creating, especially in 2024, actually. You have like Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., Joe Rogan, all these weird figures, just kind of mashed together into this coalition somehow. And it's not because they've become ideologically coherent, really. It's more that they've been given a little bit of something by Trump.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is he had a formula for winning. One of the things that has struck me the most was the conversion of, she talks about this herself. This is not talking about close doors. The New York Post reporter, Miranda Devine, I met her some years ago when she gave a talk in Australia, and she talked about how she went from being a standard conservative to being a Trump supporter because this was the guy who really wanted to fight and win. And I think that's really important. People saw in Trump, they could project things onto Trump. He didn't even have to give them that much, to be honest. The coalition of, they used to call it, there's the ad at the end of his campaign, which was like the Avengers Assemble with Tulsi and all those people. yes, that's why part of the coalition, but that's not what made the coalition so broad. He was building a broad coalition for other reasons, I think, which is that he did have this wider appeal that people could project things onto. And that was a change from the Biden years. So I think, people come along with that, and you can see the ideological schisms start. The Ben Shapiro, Tucker Carlson, Meek and Kelly war over Nick Fuentes or whatever. The schisms start almost immediately afterwards. The libertarians get upset with him because he wants to bomb Iran. There's all these different groupings. It's more than a motley crew. It's also a band of warring brothers, I guess. It's like it's inevitable if this happens, and I think maybe calling them scavenger parties is more useful than calling them catch-all parties at this stage, because the catch-all party you could join if you're a bit of an outsider, and there would be a stable third. Well, this was the Workers' Party, but it's also reaching out to migrant groups. It's also reaching out to gays and lesbians, right? I can be part of this broader coalition. We can all live together in this coalition. These are not really coalitions. Look, I think the word coalition doesn't make sense for the votes these parties get on either the cartel parties or the new contenders. I think you've got a different phenomenon happening. Not really a coalition, because a coalition suggests this groups getting together. This is scattered voters who are kind of aligning.
You mentioned these scavenger parties. I'm picturing some kind of mass extinction event, and the dinosaurs are out, and these little mammals are scurrying around. But just to ask one last question, how does this all fit into the book you're working on? I mean, I know that we've talked with you about left-wing populism. We've talked with you about right-wing populism, but you're not writing about a book about populism as far as I know.
No, it's a book about the rise of anti-politics. I guess it's an attempt to marry two things. One is the party systems literature that you talked about, Peter Mayer and his collaborators, but going back to people like Kirchheimer and so on, that looks at politics, that you have to understand modern democratic politics as being about parties, because parties are the way that politics is organized. And it's a strange thing that Marxists have by and large ignored this literature or only marginally engaged with it, because the party systems people are kind of saying there is a material basis to politics and political struggle. And Marxists are really into materialism, like it's historical materialism. And Marxists are there saying we need to find the material basis of everything. But they don't say that the material basis of politics has to be explained through parties. They say it has to be explained through the capitalist economy and how politics relates to the capitalist economy. It's like they missed the actual material structure of politics. And so you get really Marxists do the same as, I think, the liberals or the conservatives. They have this direct connection between this fundamental thing about society and politics. So the conservatives might say politics is downstream of culture. The liberals might say, well, politics is about these competing social interests, and that comes out in politics. And the Marxists say, really, politics is about social class relations and the class struggle. And yet the parties don't get figured into this. I suspect it's because all three of those groups I talk about, the conservatives, the liberals, and the Marxists, have all got their own political projects and don't want to reflect on the material basis of their own political project as organized politicos, as organized political activists or theorists or whatever. They don't want to look at their own material base. Strangely, there was someone within the tradition of Marxism who did look at this, who was Karl Marx, of course, particularly in his early writings, when he starts from the question of politics in the state, and then later comes to the conclusion that once he's understood the nature of politics in the state and its relationship to society, he needs to then understand what is it about bourgeois society that creates the politics that's like this. And so he comes to the problem of the political economy and capitalism in reverse order. He starts with politics and then goes in that direction. I think the problem for most Marxists, which hopefully my book will overcome, is to start from understanding that politics has its own logic and we have to understand its relation to society. Otherwise, we're kind of missing a step. And those party system theory is part of that.
So you've tempted a follow-up question out of me because that was very interesting. So I apologize for lying about that being my last question. But does this... I think when you approach most academics or even most people with Marxism, they sort of already know what you're going to say in a certain sense. And there's a sense that there's going to be a very ideological thing put forward. After the disastrous regimes of the 20th century, I mean, is this Marx's kind of completely unknown relevance today? It seems like it's absent from even what Marxists talk about with Marxist theory. And it seems like perhaps one of the greatest reasons why a figure like Marx would be so lionized by these state regimes, it sort of covers something up that's very central to Marx, that's convenient for them as Marxists.
Yeah, well, I think, partly they were Marxist because that was historically what they needed to do to leverage their situation. Like, there is no Stalin without first a Bolshevik revolution of some sort, which clearly was based in some way on Marx and drew on Marx in some way. But I think the thing for me about Marx is that Marx returns to the social question again and again. And this is the key thing for me. Like, we need to return to the social question. Politics has become not about society at all, really, except about how to manage it. And it's an annoying thing that you have to manage. And the Marxists are just as guilty of that as the right-wing politicos and everyone else in between. For me, this is about putting the social question back to the center. And it's kind of weird because all of Marx's work was allegedly about the social question. It certainly looks that way to me, and people talk about it that way, but the one bit where it's not applied is politics itself. And hopefully reviving some of that provides some clarity. I don't have a crystal ball. This book is not going to be a crystal ball. In fact, I think the problem with the left is it has a crystal ball that is based on replaying the past. That you can only see in your crystal ball what you're already aware of. I think there will be new problems for which human beings will have to find new solutions. But at least opening the possibility that that's what we're looking at, because everyone else on the left, including the radical left, is really looking to find some tweak that's a replay of the past. And this is a book about saying we can't do that. And therefore about, the merciless criticism of everything political.
Did I have a question?
Oh, go ahead, Joe.
No, it was just basically, I think my question was, because I think actually the book kind of gets at this, because it actually, I think, grounds populism historically pretty well. It has a very extensive section on the American populists of the late 19th century. Is populism inherent to liberal democracy? And if it is, why is it?
I think we talked a little bit about this in the last podcast, but I think it's just that question of sovereignty, of popular sovereignty. So Marx makes this point in one of his early writings that ultimately the true sovereignty of the state is in the people. But the way it's organized in existing modern society is that the state is separated from the people. I think that's why populism has an appeal. I think it's why technocracy has an appeal as well. I think it's why all the different things we've seen have an appeal, because they're all ways of trying to deal with that gap and antagonism between society and the political sphere. So I think populism is really, but what's different now, of course, again, is that the populism that they talk about historically had a social base. The current populism doesn't really have a social base in the same way. Yeah. And we come back to that again and again. That's the key question. And of course, because there isn't a social base, that's why everyone can't look at the social question or is uncomfortable looking at it, or it's almost outside their frame of reference. I expect my book, if it finally sees the light of day, is going to have people scratching their heads like, I don't understand what this social question thing is. They won't think about it that way because, of course, if they're left-wing people, they'll all be thinking about the social question all the time. But they won't, it's got to be cognitive dissonance, because where can I point to society really making its stamp on politics in a consistent way? It's not happening. Like that's the challenge, but to at least be clear about what is really, like saying empirically, this is what's going on. Whatever you want to build has to start from the fact that there is no social base for any politics right now. Where is that social base? You have to ask these questions. People presume the answers to these questions and charge into building their political project.
Right. I guess it gets to what we were talking about before, where that the antagonism between politics and civil society is growing. And perhaps that is where you have to start asking questions about where the future lies.
Is it growing, or is it just more obvious now?
No, it's a good question. I mean, it does seem that the growing distrust seems very obvious. And I think even the way, and I think even too, I wonder about this actually too. This is a bit of a side question, and honestly, we could probably do an episode of this itself. Really, has a political class or the highly politically engaged, have they become more anti-public or more openly anti-public? Have they radicalized against the public in some ways?
Maybe one way to think about it is the society has always been anti-political. There's always a tension between politics and society that is probably, like, it's consistent, like it might fluctuate a bit, but ultimately what changes with social bases being there or not is there are fewer symptoms of it. So during the period of the mass parties and the catch-all parties, the symptoms of that society, politics, and antagonism weren't as clear. In the mass party era, there was a lot of class versus class antagonism that was clear and expressed through politics, but it's not like everyone was clear about the need to destroy the state and replace it with a commune or something like that. It's not like that was might have been a minority view, and there was certainly the radicalism of working class struggles and social struggles meant that was a much more popular view, much more widespread view. But then there was a social basis for that, actual social activity, not just institutions. And now we have even the catch-all party era is the same. The symptoms weren't there because you felt connected to politics, even if you felt betrayed by it all the time. But the antagonism itself is always there. I think it's a material fact. I think we've gone like right off on a different tangent though here. This is like a whole new podcast, isn't it?
I know. And then we could obviously go into the material basis of that in private property and civil society and commodity production and all of that. But why don't we call things here? I mean, Tad, thank you for talking to us today.
Oh, it was a pleasure. It was great. And like, I think like we're all trying to think this through, because it's like kind of, it's not the thing that everyone thinks of first. And I think it's a tough argument to make. I think it's a very tough argument to make. And to even think through, even though the empirical data is all there, but to actually accept the weight of it is difficult.
So soon, had Tietze Matthew Goodwin debate on Rabble Report, hopefully.
Well, I think Professor Goodwin's turned himself into a politician, hasn't he? So,
right.
Yeah, I'd love to have a discussion with him. I think he's a really interesting guy, and and maybe he could shed more empirical light on his claims, which would be really useful, I think, because actually maybe there's data we're not aware of, and it's going to force us to rethink what we think about this stuff. Because if there's anything about this period of time, you have to give up all your old presumptions.
Yeah, it's tough to have an ego in all this, because things change very rapidly, and
politics loves egos. So
Yeah. Great. Thank you, guys. It's been really excellent. Had a great time.
Listen.